Today we have Cornie Huizenga for our fifth webinar from this year. We are very pleased to have him because we try to have diverse topics that are related to sustainable transport. So if anyone that sees this video is on the presentation is interested to participate, please contact me at that mail that is nicolasbatiola at uc.cl. We will start. About Corning, he's the Secretary General of the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, also known as SLoCaT. That is the largest multi-stakeholder partnership on sustainable low carbon transport, specifically for developing countries. So his presentation for today is called Habitat 3 and how they can help to accelerate action on sustainable urban transport. Corny, the time is yours.
I want to talk a bit about the Habitat 3 process and what is happening there, and what the linkage is with sustainable transport. Nicolas is sending me a private message saying that we still have some hello, is this better now? Test. Like Nicolas, I muted my speakers by going left to the is this better? I reduced the volume. Okay, good. So if we are now finally okay, then I will start. Okay, on the Habitat 3 process, I see that we have some people, and I think that some of you might be familiar with the Habitat 3 process. The Habitat process happens every 20 years, and the purpose is to set a agenda for sustainable urban development. However, before going into depth on the Habitat process, maybe something briefly on the SLoCaT partnership. For those of you who are not familiar with SLoCaT, SLoCaT was set up 7 years ago in 2009. And the idea was that while we had a number of organizations at that time, including, for example, ITDP, represented by Jacob, who is one of the listeners, that there were no real organizations focusing at the global level. So the feeling was that at the global level that we did not really have a representative of the sustainable transport community. And this was when the discussions on sustainable development and on climate change were starting to become more intensive. And yeah, so that's why a number of us decided to set up SLoCaT then. Currently, we have about 100 members in the SLoCaT partnership. This includes international organizations. We have several UN organizations. We have a large number of the regional economic commissions from the UN. We have the multilateral development banks. We have think tanks like International Energy Agency, International Transport Forum. We have the transport sector represented by the International Union on Railways. We have the International Association of Public Transport. We have NGOs like working on transport, like ITDP, Embark, WRI. We're obviously happy to have the BRT Center of Excellence as a member. And what we really are focusing on is integrating sustainable transport in global policies on sustainable development and climate change. We are not getting involved in implementation at the country level. That is something that our members are doing. We do see that our efforts were being appreciated, and that in 2014 this resulted in setting up of the SLoCaT Foundation, which was set up with the idea of how to raise money to support the activities of the SLoCaT Partnership. And the foundation is supported by a number of organizations, and you can see the logos here on the screen. So coming back to the mandate of SLoCaT, and that we say we would like to change global processes. So 2015 and 2016 are very important years for us, because we see that there are actually 6 key global processes which have happened or which are in the process of happening, which will enable us to really help shape the discussion on sustainable transport at the global level. And these 6 processes that we have is, if we start at the top left, is the Global Decade of Action on Road Safety. And I think that it's important that when we talk about sustainable transport, we often talk about climate, we often talk about things like congestion, etc. But we should not forget that there are currently about 1.3 million people who get killed each year in transport. And what we see is that as the cities are growing, that we also see that the number of people in cities getting killed in transport is increasing. And currently it's estimated that about 40% of the people dying in traffic accidents actually live in cities, and often these are the more vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists. So in 2010, initiated by Russia, the initiative was taken to set up the Global Decade of Action on Road Safety, and the purpose was, or the idea was, that to reduce the number of people killed in traffic accidents by 50% over a 10-year period. The second process, which is relevant, is one which took place last year, which is the Financing for Development conference. And this is a conference that takes place every 10 years, roughly. And this is where the development community comes together and say, like, how do we fund the sustainable development agenda that we as countries have agreed upon? And in the meeting last year in Addis Ababa, we saw that sustainability was also starting to get a larger role. There was quite a lot of discussion about sustainable infrastructure. Transport was not mentioned that much, but overall we feel that the shift towards the discussion on sustainable infrastructure was actually a positive sign, and which could also be more useful for the transport sector in the years to come. Then we get a biggie, which is the Sustainable Development Agenda. I think a number of you might be familiar with the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in 2000 at the beginning of the millennium, with the idea that we say, like, how can we actually address poverty, how can we address child mortality and a number of other social issues. These came to an end in 2015, and following the conference, the Rio+20 conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, the global community agreed and said that we want to continue this process, and under this we are going to come up with what we call sustainable development goals. And I will say a little bit more about these sustainable development goals in a subsequent slide, but what is important is that one out of the 17 SDGs is specifically allocated to urban development, to sustainable urban development. And for each of the goals, a number of targets have been formulated. And for goal 11 on sustainable cities, we have a specific goal on sustainable urban transport, which is about improving access to sustainable urban transport, including public transport, walking and cycling. Then we have another global process which came to an end, and that should be in 2015, the Paris Agreement on climate change. I assume that this is probably the most well-known of all the global processes, which got a lot of publicity in December of last year. The Paris Agreement was a surprise to the international community for two reasons. First of all, that after many years that the global community actually was able to reach an agreement. And secondly, the level of ambition that in Paris, the global community agreed, and they say we need to limit climate change to a maximum increase in temperature of 2 degrees, and that, let's say, encouraged by a number of the smaller island states, the global community actually agreed, and they say, like, we need to go beyond this, and we need to go actually to a 1.5 degree scenario. So, and that would be a radical departure of what we had before. It's interesting to know that the transport community, when we went to Paris last year, we were actually not that confident that there would be an agreement, and we certainly had not expected a 1.5 degree scenario target. None of the transport organizations who went to Paris had actually come up with any modeling around the 1.5 degree scenario. All the modeling that had been done was based on a 2 degree scenario, and the consensus was that that this would be very ambitious for the transport sector. Then the topic of tonight, the Habitat 3 process. Habitat is a unique process in the sense that it only takes place every 20 years. So the first Habitat conference took place in Vancouver in 1976, the second one in 1996 in Istanbul, and we now have the third one. So that means that actually the plans which are agreed upon in the Habitat conferences have a lifetime of 20 years, which is well beyond what we have in most of the other conferences. We're at the moment in the middle of the preparations for the Habitat conference in Quito. We have had a large number of preparatory activities, and what we see now is that currently there are negotiations ongoing in New York on the draft outcome document, and I will say something about that more. But overall, the news is quite good. Transport is quite well represented in the Habitat 3 agenda, and we are quite pleased to see the progress there. Then the last of the global conferences, the global processes that I wanted to mention is the UNCTAD conference, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And this is a relative newcomer when it comes to sustainable transport. This conference takes place every 4 years. It also has a negotiated outcome, and the draft document, which you can see on the UNCTAD website, currently has a nice section on sustainable freight. And there is a growing interest also within the UNCTAD conference to focus on this topic of freight, because it's very closely related to trade and development. and there is also a emphasis on urban freight in this process. So what we see is that by the end of 2016, we expect to have 6 processes in place related to a range of global topics, and all of them actually encourage or empower or enable the transport sector to take action. So, and that is something which is a first in history. Like, we have not seen such a wide-ranging number of global processes which actually acknowledge the role of transport. Then, if we move to the a little bit more in-depth discussion on the SDGs. What is important is that the SDG agenda is very much a poverty agenda, and I think that within the transport community we sometimes forget how important poverty issues are. The first SDG is about ending poverty in all of its forms everywhere. And so what we are arguing is that without the provision of robust and equitable mobility and access, this is not attainable. So without improving transport, we will not be able to fulfill the poverty agenda. And I think that we will say a little bit more about the poverty agenda in the next slide. If we talk about sustainable transport, there are often a lot of people who talk about the environmental part or the social part or the congestion part or the climate part. But I think, like, what is important from the perspective, especially from the countries in the developing countries, is that they would argue that if we talk about sustainable transport, we also need to talk about growing the transport sector. I know that the focus is on urban tonight, but just also a number for you with respect to rural transport. Currently, there are 1 billion people living in the rural areas who have no access to all-season roads. So that means that they have difficulties in getting their produce to the market. They have difficulties for the children to go to schools, to visit health facilities. So overall, 1 billion people, quite a large number. In terms of urban, we know that cities are growing. We are starting to see that the majority of people in the world live in cities. And the expectation is that between now and 2050, that we will be adding 2.5 billion more people to cities. So that's a very large number. And we need to provide transport infrastructure, and we need to provide transport services for that, for this additional 2.5 billion people in the next 35 years. But it also means that if we talk about sustainable transport, that we need to do transport differently. So we need to ensure that if we talk about increased transport activity, that this is not the business as usual transport, but that we have transport which is focusing on sustainability, on safety, on pollution, on congestion, and on climate issues. And that is like in the picture on the left, you can see that which of the SDGs, in our view, have a direct or indirect relevance to transport. And then you can see that even though that there is not a separate SDG on transport, that we are actually mainstreamed across a large number of the SDGs. I mentioned that transport is really an important element of the poverty agenda as well. So we are at the moment in the process of carrying out a literature review of the relationship between urban poverty and transport. And what we have here is a number of quotes to give you an indication of how we see this discussion unfolding. First of all, with respect to the interaction between urban poverty and transport. So we have a quote here from a gentleman in the World Bank that we say, the inability of the poor to access jobs and services is an important element of the social exclusion that defines urban poverty. So what is important here, and what comes back in the rest of the points as well, is that we say transport is a derived function. Like transport provides access, and like if we want to do something about poverty, it's not just giving the poor access to transport, but you need to also look at what kind of access does the transport provide. So if we want to reverse inequality, we need to better understand the function of access as the key transport good. So just if we have more transport or if we do have higher mobility does not necessarily represent better living conditions. What matters is the accessibility to desired destinations, which can be obtained with less movement. And one of the things that we have observed is that the transport community is actually not very good at measuring accessibility, and we are definitely not very good at measuring equity in relationship to accessibility. So personally, I really like this quote from Eduardo Vasconcelos. Equity audits will go a long way toward curbing the more common, limited pseudo-scientific technical approach to urban transport appraisal. In many cases, what you see is that if a country or a development organization is building public transport, that's almost by definition that they would say that this is pro-poor and that this is good for the poor and to address poverty. Our feeling is that you need to have a much more rigorous assessment of that. So then in terms of how do we deliver access to the poor, in principle, transport is a great enabler of economic and social opportunity, but if the range of transport services available to people of different incomes, ages, and or ethnic groups fails to keep pace with the growth in the level of such services available to the average member of society, the sustainability of that society's mobility is suspect. So we know that cities are growing very fast in various parts of the world. So the question is really like, how do we keep up with this growth of the cities in providing pro-poor sustainable transport services? Then, since our host tonight is the Center of Excellence on BRT, also quote on BRT that, so while BRT as a concept offers significant opportunities for enhancing social justice and poverty alleviation, these outcomes should not be taken for granted. They only occur under specific, well thought through conditions. So in other words, you need to really see how do you integrate poverty in the design of your BRT, and that you say like, how does the BRT actually improve access? So then coming back briefly to what the Paris Agreement means for the transport sector, I think that on the right-hand side you see a graph here, and the graph indicates that the business as usual scenario under which transport emissions are more than doubling between 1990 and 2050. And we have plotted the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario. So what you can see here is really like the radical change that we need to have. It means that if we would move to a 1.5 degree scenario, it means that we largely need to decarbonize the transport sector. And it is clear that if we talk about the urban environment, that especially the urban environment would be the first which would have to decarbonize. And I think that this is a key message which we have been driving home in the context of the Habitat 3 agenda as well, is that we say like, if the Habitat process only takes place every 20 years, it means that the next one is in 2036, then it means that the outcome of Habitat 3 in Quito in October really needs to set the tone for a full decarbonization of the transport sector, especially in the urban areas. And it's clear that we are still quite far away from this. So in general, if we frame the discussion on sustainable urban transport, that what we are saying is that we need to bring together the climate change and the sustainable development agenda. So this is our convergence argument. Up to now, we still see too much let's say a silo approach where there are very intensive discussions on climate change and transport or on road safety and transport, but we don't really see these discussions coming together. The second thing is ambition. It is clear that a bit of sustainable transport is nice, but it is not doing the job. We really need to scale up the work on sustainable transport that we have been working on. It's important in our work on sustainable transport to have a balanced approach. Like we need to combine things like land use planning, modal shift, and technological improvements. Neither of these by itself will be able to solve the problems that we are faced with. And it's only if we have an integrated approach of these three elements that we can move forward. We really need to acknowledge that sustainable transport is also about development of the transport sector, and that if we do not have a narrative which allows us to explain to the developing world how the people in the rural areas and the people in the urban areas who currently lack access to markets, jobs, and schools and things like that, how their access will be improved, we will not have a good narrative. And then it's clear that we need to empower both the overall sustainable development of the cities as well as other kinds of sectors. We cannot have an isolated approach to transport. It needs to be a cross-cutting approach, which obviously needs to include the transport sector. So at the beginning of this year, when the Habitat process kicked off in earnest, when people were talking about the outcome document, which is currently being negotiated in New York, we indicated that it is important to acknowledge that there needs to be different targets for different parts of the world. The developed countries, the countries in transition, and the least developed countries will not be all moving at the same speed. They also do not have the same priorities. Like it's clear that a topic like greenhouse gas emissions is much more relevant in the developed countries than in the developing countries. Like the developing countries will be focusing much more on how do we grow the transport sector. What is clear is that we need to have a massive expansion of walking, cycling, and public transport. So we really need to say goodbye to the car-dependent development model for the cities. What is important to realize is that investments in sustainable transport are actually have good returns, especially if you look at the benefits to society. So we are not it's clear that if we are able to improve, for example, public transport, we are reducing air pollution, we are reducing congestion, we are reducing traffic accidents, and all of these have benefits to society that should be taken into account in policy making. It's clear that if we talk about policy making on urban development and transport, that we need to have an inclusive approach, and we need to make certain that all sectors are really included in this. So we communicated with the people who were formulating the new urban agenda, and we say like there are 5 specific requirements that the SLoCaT Partnership has, what we would like to see come out of the new urban agenda. The first one is that the new urban agenda should call on cities to set ambitious targets for safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems by 2030. And overall, I said that we are relatively happy with the draft text of the new urban agenda. It talks very much about the need for safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport. But we feel that overall, the new urban agenda, and this is not just limited to the transport sector, that there is not enough emphasis on setting targets. So at the moment, it is still too much of a qualitative agenda, and it does not go enough into quantitative targets. The second point is that new urban agenda should, under the new urban agenda, national government should commit to provide cities with the appropriate supporting national policy frameworks, including finance, to empower them to deliver sustainable urban transport. The Habitat 3 process is actually a process which is mainly dominated by national level governments. The interesting thing is that in terms of the official delegates going to Quito this year, that cities will be part of that. And overall, the new urban agenda does a relatively good job in acknowledging the need for national governments to provide the enabling policy frameworks and also to provide enabling finance for cities to implement the new urban agenda. And we think that this is something where the transport sector can benefit as well. The third one is that we say that the new urban agenda must call for new forms of integrated land use planning to reduce the demand for urban transport and to recognize the need to allocate road space to maximize mobility. Obviously, there is a lot of references in the new urban agenda to land use planning. There is a reference to the need for compact cities, but we still feel that the link is not sufficiently made between compact cities and reduced demand for urban transport. Like, if we go back to 2.5 billion people which will be added to the cities of the world, it is a very clear question, like, are we building more cities like Los Angeles, or are we building more cities like Tokyo or Amsterdam? So if we are able to build compact cities, that will be one of the biggest contributions that we can make towards sustainable mobility. The second part of this bullet, the need to allocate road space to maximize mobility. This is something where we feel that the new urban agenda could be a bit stronger. That in various preparatory meetings, which took place in different parts of the world, there was a fair amount of consensus that we need to change the paradigm for the transport sector, and that we need to get away from a car-dominated transport infrastructure to a public transit, walking and cycling dominated transport infrastructure. And this is something that we think is not yet sufficiently incorporated in the process. Then the fourth one is on finance. It is terribly important to really ensure that the new urban agenda is not just saying, okay, this is the agenda on what needs to be done, without really considering the finances. Because otherwise we are, let's say, we have a nice agenda, but in a way the cities would be powerless in terms of implementing it. Then urban transport needs to be mainstreamed in all relevant sections of the document. So going back to what we saw for the Sustainable Development Goals, is that we do not have a separate transport SDG, but we see that transport is being mainstreamed in a number of different sections. And this is something that we feel should be done in the new urban agenda as well. Then we also said that there are 5 things which should stop, and where the new urban agenda can play an important role in reversing the trends. So the first one is investments in car-oriented transport infrastructure. The second is urban sprawl and low density development. The third is stop and reverse the lack of dedicated facilities for walking, cycling, and public transport. The fourth is stop and reverse the high parking requirements for new commercial and residential developments. And the last one is that, coming back to the finance issue, is that we say we should stop and reverse the unfunded sustainable transport policy mandates. So this is what we have been communicating to the negotiators in New York, and we are happy to say that that transport is relatively well being picked up. Currently, we are tracking the negotiations, and we are also commenting. And the web link that you see here, this is where you can actually see what the SLoCaT view is and what our comments are on the negotiations as they are unfolding. In terms of implementation, SLoCaT is also looking at the Quito event, and we say that in addition to the new urban agenda, where we do see an acknowledgement of the importance of transport, that we would also like to see that how do we mobilize action so that we can really communicate that this is a action-oriented event and that the transport sector is ready to move on this. So in that context, we are currently organizing and bringing together a large range of transport stakeholders who would make a commitment in Quito on the action that they are going to take to support the implementation of what is in the new urban agenda. We will also organize a number of special transport days at these global events, and we're doing that in Surabaya as part of the last preparatory conference for Habitat 3. So that's in July, and then we are having another large event in Quito in October of this year. And then obviously we will also be doing something during the climate change conference in Marrakesh in Morocco later this year. And that was actually what I wanted to share with you. So I think
thank you, Cornie, for your presentation. Please, I have